Hello everyone and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Battletoads, a beat-em-up platforming, speed biking, surfing, torture simulator developed by Rare and published by Trade West for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1991, with a few less torturous ports to the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, Nintendo Game Boy, and Amiga computer platform following in later years. We're going to talk about that title in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode 101. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly gaming challenges, monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards. It's all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star count or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really good experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these titles to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Battletoads. Battletoads is a multifaceted game combining beat-em-up sections, platforming, speed biking, surfing, and a bunch of other stuff that was developed by Rare and published by Tradewest for the NES back in 1991, with a bunch of other ports following in later years. Before we can talk about Battletoads, we need to take a step back and talk about the early years of Rare's relationship with Nintendo, a collaboration that would result in a ton of all-time classic titles being released over the years. Before we do that, though, I should mention that this is yet another Rare-focused episode, and for some of you, this might be feeling a bit like a Rare replay. Not the game compilation released in 2015, mind you, but more of a frequent refresher on Rare and its contributions to the video game industry. The simple fact is that Rare was responsible for so many well-respected and world-renowned titles over its lifetime that it shouldn't be too much of a shock that we're covering a good chunk of their gamography. Perhaps I could have done a better job with the scheduling of individual episodes to break things up a bit, but regardless, Rare is an important company in video game history, and their games were significant releases that countless gamers know and love even today. I promise we'll take a little bit of a break from Rare's work for at least a couple months, but I can't promise we won't revisit them again in the future. There are just too many major releases by the company to not talk about them. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's start talking once again about Rare, the UK company founded by brothers Chris and Tim Stamper that began its life as Ultimate Play the Game in 1982 and would, for several years after its founding, focus on creating games for the UK microcomputer market, most prominently the ZX Spectrum line of computers developed by Sinclair Research. As Ultimate Play the Game, the Stampers had some early successes with creating innovative titles that were unlike the kinds of gaming experiences that other game development studios typically developed. And this concept of constantly trying to create something new and innovative as opposed to stereotypical and derivative would form the foundation of the company's DNA from the very beginning of its existence. Despite releasing some pretty popular ZX Spectrum titles in the years after the company was formed, the Stampers recognized that if they wanted to grow as a company, they needed to expand and diversify beyond the UK-centric, fairly limited ZX Spectrum market. And here, an opportunity would present itself in 1985 that would change the trajectory of the company's future forever. In 1985, software publisher Ocean was in talks to purchase Ultimate Play the Game, along with any related licenses and other intellectual property, and the Stampers realized that this sale was likely going to happen, whether they wanted it to or not. So they decided to stand up a separate shell company of sorts, which they called Rare Limited, as a means of insulating themselves and their team from any of the corporate politics that were accompanying Ocean's buyout of Ultimate Play the Game, which further allowed the Stampers to sell their share of the company without issue. No longer tethered to Ultimate Play the Game, the Stampers turned their attention entirely to the formalization and stabilization of Rare Limited. With their new company established, the Stampers now had to figure out where they wanted to focus and what kinds of games they wanted to create. They knew they wanted to standardize on a stable technology platform, something that wouldn't have a ton of variability that would need to be accounted for whenever they created a new title, which meant that the computer market of the time was effectively out, since there were a huge number of proprietary systems, hardware, and software that made developing for anything other than a singular computer platform a challenge. And they knew they wanted to choose a technology platform that would have a fairly large number of users, with the potential for even greater growth, since their prior efforts on the ZX Spectrum, while successful, had an upper bound for potential sales given the relatively small size of the market. Those factors are what led Rare to begin looking across the broader video game landscape, at which point they started to learn more about Nintendo's 8-bit family computer, or Famicom, home console that had just released a couple years prior in Japan, and was just about to make its way to the North American market and other geographic regions. To call the Famicom a major console release would be an understatement, as it quickly gained a foothold in the Japanese gaming market, and all indications were that it was going to take over the North American gaming market as well, effectively with no competition given the 1983 video game market crash that left companies like Atari on life support. Rare saw Nintendo's 8-bit platform as an opportunity to increase their presence in the market, and were hopeful that they would be able to replicate their earlier success on a much larger scale, which in turn would make the company more profitable and allow them to tackle bigger and better games in the future. There was just one problem. Nintendo wasn't in the habit of simply giving development kits out to small independent developers, and Rare didn't have the working capital to buy their way into the Famicom ecosystem. So they did the only thing an aspiring group of talented game developers could do. They hacked their way into the industry. Okay, maybe not literally, but in fact, they did sort of hack their way into Nintendo's good graces. For those who may not be aware, when Nintendo released the Famicom, they designed it so that unless you were one of their formal licensees, there was no way to actually release a title for the system, because you wouldn't have the technical tools or software needed to bypass Nintendo's hard-coded copy protection schemes. This was done for a couple of reasons, the most prominent of which was Nintendo's desire to exert control over which video game studios could develop games for their system, as well as a drive to limit the number of games each studio could release in a given year, all of which was an attempt at minimizing the potential of low-effort, poor-quality titles flooding the market and eroding consumer confidence in Nintendo as a company. What this meant was that if you were going to develop games for a Nintendo console, Nintendo itself had to give you the keys to its virtual kingdom. Despite not having a formal agreement in place with Nintendo, Rare decided to import a Famicom console and sat down to effectively reverse engineer the console, bypassing the copy protection that Nintendo had touted as impossible to crack, and creating a series of demos that they hoped would prove Rare's prowess as a technically talented and creative team of video game designers. Rare ended up sending that set of demos into Nintendo, and in an almost unheard of move, Nintendo was so impressed with Rare's work that they offered them a development partnership contract and even offered to fund all of Rare's upcoming titles, as long as all of those games would remain Nintendo exclusives. For a small company like Rare, that offer was a dream come true, so they immediately accepted Nintendo's conditions and began working more closely together, a relationship that would last for almost 20 years and would see the two companies collaborate on countless titles. In fact, in just the 5 years following Nintendo and Rare forming their partnership, Rare developed over 40 titles for various Nintendo platforms, including arcade cabinets, the NES home console, and the Game Boy portable console, with a number of those games becoming well respected across the industry and much beloved by gamers around the world. Rare would work on a ton of different types of games during this time frame, with one of their biggest focus areas being licensed titles for various products, including films like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, sports like WWF WrestleMania and John Elway's Quarterback, and television shows like Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, and Sesame Street, while also dabbling in original properties like the Wizards and Warriors series, Snake Rattle and Roll, and RC Pro-Am. Across all of these efforts, Rare enjoyed a pretty high level of success, with multiple titles selling millions of copies, which proved to gamers and the industry at large that Rare was a force to be reckoned with. The thing is though, regardless of how successful you or your company may be, there is always an opportunity to reach even greater heights, and as 1990 started to draw to a close, the leadership team at Rare began thinking about how to expand their overall profits, while continuing to develop and release video games that would hopefully wow gamers. And here, Rare decided to turn their attention to the video game industry at large, as well as general pop culture of the time, to help guide them in selecting their next game to work on. If we take a look at the video game industry of the late 80s into the early 90s, one of the most popular game genres of the time was the arcade side-scrolling beat-em-up title, where players could either go solo or team up with a friend to beat up a ton of bad guys across a number of diverse stages, all in the hopes of cleaning up the streets from rival gangs, or preventing a worldwide catastrophe, or saving a damsel in distress, or any number of other situations that could only be solved with brute force and fisticuffs. Games like Double Dragon, Final Fight, and others were providing players with a dose of visceral, over-the-top action, and gamers everywhere were clamoring for more and more pure beat-em-up action. At the same time, the late 80s saw a number of crossover properties that were in the process of dominating television, comic books, film, toy merchandise, and even video games, with perhaps one of the biggest cultural fads of the era being the multi-billion-dollar Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle franchise. These Heroes in a Half Shell originated as a comic book series originally released in 1984 and became a surprise mega hit, spawning an entire franchise of cartoon series, video games, toys, costumes, movies, and various other media and merchandise that remains popular even today. The action figures and toys based on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles warrants particular mention, as that particular toy line became a marketing and commercial juggernaut, and over the course of the 4 years following release, it made around $1.1 billion and accounted for nearly 60% of all action figure sales across the entire toy industry. Similar, though not quite astronomical, levels of success accompanied TMNT's continued comic book releases, syndicated cartoon series, and video game entries. And I'd venture a guess, if you were someone with a pulse above the age of 3 in the late 80s, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were undoubtedly a part of your life in some capacity. As Rare co-founders Tim and Chris Stamper deliberated on what their next game should be, they were keenly aware of the popularity of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle franchise, as well as the expanding number of beat-em-up titles taking over arcades and the home console market. And they considered, what if the company's next game could be based on an original intellectual property with mass market appeal, something that could transcend the video game market and become, hopefully, a mega success like TMNT, with toys and other merchandise, an animated television series, and other related spin-offs. If Rare could crack that code, then they'd almost certainly reach levels of popularity and profit beyond even their wildest expectations. While visions of 3 comma profits danced in their heads, Rare began to conceptualize what such an intellectual property would look like, settling on a group of anthropomorphic toads who, similar to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, would kick butt and look cool doing it, with an initial focus on creating a Disney-esque collection of popular, cartoonishly violent antagonists to combat the group of humanoid toads that players would likely control. This, in a nutshell, formed the foundation of Rare's next game, the arcade-styled beat-em-up that would come to be known as Amphibians. Work on Amphibians began in late 1990, and from the very beginning of its development cycle, the team was focused on creating a beat-em-up title that would defy expectations and, in their own words, put a Rare spin on the traditional beat-em-up genre. Rather than create a series of levels where the beat-em-up action remained the same from one stage to the next, the team at Rare wanted to introduce a number of different mechanics throughout the game where players would never know what to expect when they reached the next stage of their journey. Nearly everything was fair game, from typical beat-em-up fare to fast-paced obstacle courses to traditional platforming levels to one-on-one races where your success or failure would directly correspond to life and death. As work on the game progressed, so too did the level of violence on display, which for anyone familiar with Nintendo's policies in the early 90s, you realize that violence in a Nintendo game simply wasn't acceptable. To address this potential issue before Nintendo made them address it, the team took great efforts to both tone down and mask that violence behind cartoon-styled imagery. The thought being that if the game felt more like an interactive cartoon, the violence would be viewed more comedically as opposed to more viscerally. As artists work on the cartoon-inspired visuals, game designers continued to refine the overall gameplay mechanics for the title, and like I mentioned earlier, the variety of different levels in the game was being viewed as one of the big selling points that the team hoped would drive success in the market. At this point though, the team faced a decision point. Do they create a game that is moderately challenging, hoping that players would find longevity in repeated playthroughs due to the sheer quality of the design? Or do they create a game that is excessively difficult in the hopes that players would continue to play the game in an effort to conquer it, with the overall length of the game being driven by difficulty rather than the joy of replaying a satisfying title? Well, it didn't take long before Rare decided that making the game a more difficult experience was the right approach. The thought being that a challenging game would prevent players from beating it during a weekend rental, which they figured would lead to higher total sales for the game. They still wanted to design a worthwhile experience. They just wanted to design a really hard worthwhile experience, and they thought that if they could marry expert design with excessive difficulty, they might have a mammoth hit on their hands. There was just one final problem to solve. The name Amphibians didn't really convey an action-packed experience, especially for a title that represented the first effort in what would hopefully become a massive media franchise. Even making the title have a Z at the end, which was the 90s way of marking something as edgy and cool, didn't fully get across that this group of Galaxy defenders were totally rad and badass, and that players should play this game. So, the team went back to the drawing board, eventually coming up with a new name that they thought better conveyed the overall tone of the game. From that point forward, the game previously known as Amphibians would be rechristened as Battletoads. With the new name and the rest of the game complete, Battletoads would release in North America in June of 1991, following a successful showing at the 1991 Winter Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, in Chicago earlier in the year. Upon its release, the game would be critically acclaimed, with many publications praising the game's graphics, soundtrack, gameplay diversity, and challenging level of difficulty. It didn't take long before the game would be nominated as one of, if not the, best 8-bit title of 1991, and numerous magazines declared Battletoads to be one of the best games ever created. Gamers, meanwhile, had similar high praise for the title, and the game's popularity would propel it to the top of sales charts for over 2 years following its initial release. To say that Battletoads was a huge success would be an understatement. Interestingly, despite significant sales, it didn't take long before gamers began to grumble about the game's difficulty, a sentiment that exists and persists all the way to the present day, where Battletoads is widely considered to be one of the hardest games ever made, with the third level in particular, the Turbo Tunnel, being declared as one of the hardest challenges in any game ever created. While we'll talk more about my opinion on the game's overall difficulty, all I'll say for now is that anyone who considers the Turbo Tunnel to be one of the most challenging levels ever made hasn't had the distinct pleasure of playing every level following that stage. Anyway, despite the general perception around the game's difficulty, Battletoads would become very popular across the industry, so much so that Rare did in fact work on a number of ports, sequels, and spin-offs in the years following its initial release. Somewhat amusingly, all ports of the original title had their difficulty reduced in some capacity, whether slightly relaxed timing like in the Japanese version of the game, or tweaks to a number of stages to make the game easier to complete, like how the Sega Genesis version of the title removed some deadly obstacles, made some unkillable enemies killable, and slowed down the pace of gameplay to make the title less dependent on twitch reflexes. It is certainly telling that every port following the original release had their difficulty toned down. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Rare admitted to making the game too hard to begin with, but it certainly seems like Rare was trying to course correct based on initial player feedback. Regardless, Battletoads as a video game franchise would continue to be fairly popular throughout the early to mid-90s. But unfortunately, Rare's plan for world domination using a Battletoads-fueled media blitz never came to fruition. While there was an attempt to spin up a Battletoads cartoon in 1992 similar to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that effort never got beyond the pilot phase of production. And while a series of Battletoads toys and action figures would finally be developed in 2020, nearly 30 years following the original game's release, that would be too little, too late. And to the best of my knowledge, those Battletoads toys are not nearly as popular as TMNT, even when looking at today's toy market. Despite Rare's best efforts, Battletoads never broke the chains of its video game origins, though I truly believe that shouldn't be held against the collective efforts of the team behind the game. With Battletoads, Rare would release yet another hit game, continuing their streak of developing quality titles that gamers and critics around the world loved, while further proving to the video game industry and their closest partner, Nintendo, that Rare was a company full of talented staff. Battletoads' release, amongst other efforts, would directly lead to Rare becoming even more respected by Nintendo, and when the time came for someone to save the 16-bit Super Nintendo Entertainment System from being trampled by 32-bit competition in 1994, Nintendo knew exactly who they needed to turn to. That story, however, is a topic for another day. And more specifically, another podcast episode. If you're curious about that discussion, check out our episode on Donkey Kong Country. Battletoads is one of those titles that is difficult to forget, and whether gamers remember it for its brutal difficulty, varied gameplay mechanics, or general Rare polish, the fact is, gamers everywhere still remember Battletoads. It remains a beloved classic, and as such, is definitely a game that deserves to be recognized and respected, even today. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Battletoads today versus when it was released over 30 years ago. Battletoads, at its core, is an action platformer beat-em-up title, similar in some ways to other 8-bit era action games like Double Dragon and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, in that you will play through a bunch of different levels, beat up a fair number of bad guys, defeat bosses, and make your way past, over, and around various environmental hazards. And if you're just hearing that description, and you've never played or seen Battletoads before, you would be excused for assuming it's just another run-of-the-mill NES action experience. The thing is though, Battletoads is anything but run-of-the-mill, and as we'll see, its design and underlying quantity of gameplay mechanics and unique situations truly do set it apart from its peers. So let's talk about the general structure of Battletoads, which like I mentioned is fairly similar to other action platforming titles from the late 80s and early 90s. In Battletoads, you'll be responsible for making your way through 12 levels, each of which is populated by various enemies, obstacles, and challenges to overcome. The interesting thing with these levels is that none of them are entirely alike, and each one has some form of unique mechanic that serves to diversify the gameplay and, at the same time, keep players constantly guessing as to what is going to come next. To better illustrate that fact, let's go through each of the levels in the game and talk about how each one presents a different gameplay experience than the last. The first level is called Ragnarok's Canyon, and it is perhaps the most straightforward and traditional level in the entire game, while also being a fairly good tutorial for letting players get used to the core beat-em-up mechanics that Rare programmed into the game. As you start up the level, you'll notice a couple of things. For one, there is no time limit, which means you can take your time as you explore the game, which is especially useful on later levels that can occasionally require careful deliberation before attempting a tricky jump or tackling a difficult enemy. Secondly, you'll notice that you have a life bar, which suggests that the game uses some sort of damage system as opposed to a more challenging one-hit kill kind of design. And yes, the majority of enemies you face will take a chunk of your health bar off, but you'll ultimately live to fight another day. There are a pretty good number of enemies and environmental hazards, though, that will deplete your health bar entirely, either via a true one-hit kill kind of maneuver, or, in what is vastly more frustrating, via a juggle attack that you literally cannot break free of once it starts. We'll talk more about those individual situations as we continue discussing the game, but I figured I'd mention it up front as a prelude of sorts for what's to come. Anyway, back to the first level, this is where you'll get your first taste of the beat-em-up action in the game, which as you might expect, consists of unleashing a series of punches, kicks, and jumps on your enemies. In what I thought was a nice touch, the game utilizes a combo system of sorts, where if you string together several consecutive hits, your final attack will be a much stronger move, either a big oversized uppercut, a comic book styled kick, or in some instances a double axe handle strike that, like the other two big hit moves, will oftentimes do significant damage to your opponents. Another way to do big quick damage is by using your dash headbutt attack, which can be executed by double tapping either left or right on your directional pad and then pressing your attack button at an appropriate time to lunge head first and hopefully ram your opponent to the ground. This maneuver will become a staple of your entire playthrough, and I'm not lying when I say that many playthroughs, at least on YouTube, seem to have people who use this lunge attack almost exclusively throughout the entire game. While I didn't end up doing that, I can see the allure, because not only do you do a good chunk of damage with that move, but you also knock enemies away from you, assuming you do hit them that is, which can be incredibly effective at creating space between you and the bad guys who desperately want to wreck your day. Also in Stage 1, you'll encounter your first robotic stilt-legged creature, which if you defeat it will reward you with a pipe that you can pick up and also use to pummel your opponents. This pipe adds significant range to your attacks, and while it doesn't appear to be quite as damaging as one of the end of combo finishers or the lunging headbutt, the pipe is something you'll want to use whenever possible, as it lets you maintain distance from the dangerous enemies you'll face throughout the game, while also giving you an easy way to juggle some of the bad guys for nearly continuous, unanswerable damage, which is great when you can pull that off. Regardless of whether you're fighting with your fists, your feet, or a pipe, you'll notice one thing as soon as you end up facing multiple enemies at the same time, and that is that only one bad guy can be hit at a time, meaning if you get surrounded by several bad guys, you have no way to fend off their attacks effectively, or to bunch them up and unleash a volley of attacks on all of them at the same time. This can be a pretty big issue in different sections of the game, as you will be unable to handle groups of enemies without singling them out, which, while doable, is a bit of an oddity considering traditional beat-em-up styled gameplay, especially for a game made in the early 90s. This odd design decision will likely lead to some lost hit points until you get used to it, but luckily the game does give you a way to replenish some health, as in certain levels you'll see a group of flies fly onto the screen that can be eaten, assuming you do so quickly enough, because they will fly away after a short time. Each fly you eat replenishes a single hit point, which can definitely be useful in keeping your health as full as possible. Assuming you make your way through the stage without dying, which for the first level should be doable, you'll face the first boss of the game, which in comparison to most other 8-bit titles from around this time, is entirely unique. The screen turns red and your perspective is changed to that of a robotic attacker as it watches your character on the screen and targets you with a crosshair to unleash machine gun fire at you. While the boss is pretty easy to beat by throwing some rocks at it, which considering the perspective of the fight is actually throwing rocks towards the television screen, the mechanics at play here are pretty darn cool, and I've got to say, that first boss fight gives a lasting impression that make you think that this game is probably going to be something special. As you enter Stage 2, which is called the Wookiee Hole, you'll be presented with an entirely different gameplay experience. In this level, you'll be descending an underground cave shaft, battling a number of killer birds, toad-eating plants, and electricity-shooting robots along the way, all the while you dangle from a rope, effectively rappelling deeper and deeper into the cave. By default, your attack in this level is a simple swinging kick, though if you hold left or right on your D-pad for several seconds, you'll turn into a wrecking ball, which you can then use to swing forcefully across the screen, killing every enemy in your path. And unlike the game's beat-em-up mechanics, this move can hit multiple enemies at one time. By defeating certain birds, you can also catch what I'm assuming is their long, sharp beak, which you can then use as a sort of sword for the rest of the level, which is a nice touch. Eventually, you'll make your way down the shaft, past some moving electrical barriers, and will thankfully beat the level, hopefully without too much difficulty. Stage 3 is the Turbo Tunnel, and if you're like the vast majority of gamers, this is likely the spot where your first playthrough, or perhaps your first 20 or so playthroughs of the game will end abruptly. The Turbo Tunnel starts out like a normal beat-em-up stage, just like the first level, but around halfway through, you'll get on a speeder bike and be tasked with riding through the rest of the level at a rapid speed, avoiding walls, barriers, and enemies along the way. The game does telegraph where an obstacle is going to be coming from, so there is a brief moment where you can move and avoid that obstacle. But unless you've played through the level a few times, there is a very real likelihood that your reflexes won't be fast enough, and you'll end up losing whatever lives you have left pretty darn quickly. Luckily, the game does give you 3 continues that allow you to restart whatever level you were just playing. Unluckily, you only have 3 continues for the entirety of the game, and there is no way to earn additional continues. You can earn extra lives by either finding 1-ups in various stages or by accumulating multiples of 100,000 points, which is incredibly useful, but you still have a limited continue allotment before you have to start the entire game over from the beginning. In positive news, some levels do have warps that allow you to skip a level or 2, which is helpful in getting back to where you may have died, especially if it was later in the game. Depending on which warps you take though, you may end up missing some extra life opportunities, which means to warp or not to warp becomes an essential question you must answer for yourself as you play the game. Back to the level itself, as I was preparing to play Battletoads, I had both first-hand familiarity with and internet knowledge of the Turbo Tunnel, and if you look on any list of hardest games of all time, you'll not only see Battletoads mentioned, but you'll see the Turbo Tunnel referenced frequently as being one of the hardest levels ever created for a game. And the first bunch of times you play the level, you'll likely think that the internet's assertion is true, because it can be really tricky to time your bike's movements to avoid the obstacles flying at you. That being said, after playing this game for far longer than what I ever wanted to, I can affirm with certainty that the Turbo Tunnel is mere child's play in comparison to the levels that will follow, and by the time I beat the game, I could pretty much fly the Turbo Tunnel with my eyes closed. Literally. It's certainly a challenge to overcome, but it is truly the 3rd easiest level in the entire game, and my suspicion is that the reason it gets so much attention and hate on the internet is that many players simply didn't put in the time to actually get past it to see what the hell was awaiting them in later levels. And speaking of later levels, Stage 4 is the Arctic Caverns, which as its name suggests is the contractually required ice level that needs to appear in every platforming title ever made, complete with slippery floors, snowball throwing snowmen, deadly stalactites, and in what I thought was a particularly evil touch, slippery platforms moving over spike pits, which I can only assume was declared a true chef's kiss moment by Satan. This level contains no enemies to defeat other than the aforementioned snowmen, who, by the way, can one-hit kill you with a vicious uppercut that comes literally out of nowhere if you stand too close to one. While the level may not have many enemies to defeat, it does contain a bunch of enemies and obstacles to avoid, like moving spike-backed creatures, spiky ceilings and floors, errant thrown and rolling snowballs, and sliding ice blocks. Longtime listeners may recall that I've gone on record as saying that I really don't care for ice-based levels in games, and Battletoads did absolutely nothing to make me change my mind. In fact, it reaffirmed my belief that ice levels are the work of some sort of pact between game developers and an evil entity who gets its jollies watching players suffer. I have no proof of that assumed dark presence and soul-stealing agreement, but it seems reasonable to me. After you slip and slide your way through the frozen version of hell, you'll hit Stage 5, which is Surf City, a level that introduces another new mechanic, which in this case is riding surfboards down a waterway that is littered with logs, whirlpools, and eventually deadly mines. This stage is broken up into 3 parts, with the first section being a nice and leisurely surf down a river where you have to avoid some stationary and moving logs and spinning whirlpools, which honestly is not all that bad to get through. The second section of the stage is a beat-em-up section which culminates with a boss fight against Mickey Mouse's more rotund and flea-ridden cousin Big Blag. Here, you'll be introduced to the fact that bosses will absolutely destroy you if you let them get a hit in on you, while also being introduced to the fact that anytime a boss raises up off the ground, it has a chance of crushing you like the insignificant amphibian you are, making you lose a life in the process. The most awesome moments are when this rat villain knocks you to the ground, locking you in an unmovable position for a few seconds, and follows that knockdown move with a flying butt bomb, crushing the life and soul out of your body. The good news is, this seedy rodent from the bad side of town can be juggled against the side of the screen, assuming you were able to make it here with a pipe in hand, which feels so good after you finally figure out how to trivialize the encounter. Oh, I should mention that before this fight, you'll be attacked by a series of Space Invader enemies. Yes, literal Space Invaders, who will steal your hit points one block at a time. You can attack them and recover those lost hit points, but occasionally you'll miss one, resulting in lower hit points for the rest of the level, or until you eat some flies. I don't recall if this was the first stage to use those Space Invaders, or if that honor belongs to the Turbo Tunnel, but it is a mechanic that I definitely wanted to mention. Anyway, assuming you beat up Ratty McRatterson, you'll enter the third section of this stage, which is another surfing excursion, only this time with randomly appearing mines that will kill you in a single hit. This section itself is split up into a few different sections, with the speed increasing the further you get in the level. This, by the way, is a much more egregious design than the Turbo Tunnel, because there is no telegraphing of where mines will appear. They're all entirely random. With the Turbo Tunnel, at least repeated playthroughs will get easier until you eventually master the level. No such luck with these mines, as some runs you'll make it through entirely unscathed, while others will feel like the game is attempting to troll you by sending mines in a configuration that makes it literally impossible to dodge, depending on where you are on the screen. Regardless, with quick enough reflexes and luck, you'll make it past Surf City and arrive at Stage 6, which is Karnath's Lair. This stage is unlike any other stage you've seen before, as there are no enemies at all, which might make it sound like this level would be a walk in the park. Instead, though, you have to progress through a series of platforming challenges on the backs of moving snakes as they weave their way around multiple screens, through and around spike traps, and at different speeds, all in the hopes of making you fall to your death or jump into a deadly set of spikes. There are 4 different screens of snakes to make your way through, with the first one being an area where you literally cannot die, and the final one being an area which requires several blind jumps to hopefully not die. I've got to admit, I enjoyed the concept behind this level, but I really disliked the mechanics, and the fact that there were a couple of areas that you needed to take leaps of faith in order to progress was, from my perspective, poor design. This is the kind of level that will make you pull your hair out, especially the final screen, and I would say this is the second major gut check stage in the game, following the Turbo Tunnel section from level 3. If you can snake rattle and roll your way through Karnath's Lair though, you'll reach the 7th Circle of Hell. The 7th stage in the game, Volkmeyer's Inferno, which like the Turbo Tunnel is split into 2 sections. The first is a traditional beat-em-up area, with a couple of screens with dive-bombing, rocket-riding jerks thrown in for good measure, and one particularly aggravating platforming section involving jumping and riding several logs across what is apparently a deadly lake of water. Those logs, by the way, do not follow the same path that you would expect in many platforming titles, so careful observation is needed to make sure you don't miss those jumps. The second section of the stage is a speeder bike flying area, where you'll be tasked with passing through narrow openings and electrified fences before facing 2 consecutive, completely randomized death tunnels, the first of which requires you to dodge a ton of fireballs that fly at you horizontally from off-screen, with the second being an area where missiles shoot vertically into the air before eventually crashing down towards the bottom of the screen. Both of these sections are infuriating to play through, and can eat your lives incredibly quickly if you happen to get some bad random placements of the missiles or fireballs. And then, assuming you get past those sections, you'll reach the final, super fast section of the level, where you'll have to move through a series of telegraphed electric fence openings similar to the Turbo Tunnel's telegraphed walls, only this time, with dramatically tighter timing required to survive. If you thought the Turbo Tunnel was bad, this is where you'll realize that you were entirely wrong. Eventually, with enough practice and luck, you'll make your way to level 8, which is the Intruder Excluder, a large elevator shaft kind of level where you have to climb multiple vertical platforms, including using some springy platforms, to go higher and higher in the elevator shaft. This level introduces you to several new enemies, including electricity-shooting drones, a gas emitter that, if you manage to touch the cloud of noxious fumes, will instantly kill you, and a series of fans that will suck you into their blades, once again leading to an immediate death. Assuming you make it past those enemies, you'll be greeted with another boss fight, this time against a super soldier kind of enemy who jumps around the screen before firing a series of 4 projectiles in your direction. From my perspective, this boss is incredibly frustrating for a couple different reasons. For one, he has the ability to stomp you into oblivion if you happen to be underneath him when he lands on the ground, which is, you likely guessed, an instant kill. And secondly, his projectile move. Let me tell you about that projectile move. To start, it is entirely avoidable, as all you need to do is duck and those projectiles will fly above your head without any chance of striking you. So far, so good. The issue is that if you do get hit by one, say when you're in the middle of an attack, you will almost assuredly be juggled by the remaining projectiles, which will end up depleting your entire health bar. Even if you only get hit by one projectile, you'll be knocked to the ground, and depending on which stage of the fight you're in, will likely have another series of projectiles shot towards you before you can even stand up. And guess what? If you're on the ground when a projectile or attack is sent your way, you'll still be hit and juggled until you die. Lying on the ground is not a safe harbor. It is simply preparing you for an early grave. So let's say you somehow defeat that guy. Well, you'll then be treated to Stage 9, which is the Terror Tubes, a series of pipes and underwater passageways that earns the distinction for being the level with the most irritating, infuriatingly designed enemies in the entire game. First, you have the electricity-spewing robots, who if you accidentally get too close to them, will explode, killing you in the process. Then you have chompy fish, who appear to be an early version of Lockjaw from Rare's later Donkey Kong Country games. This fish, which I will simply refer to as Devil Piranha, will lunge at you with a biting attack that if they hit you, will take some of your hit points while knocking you back a fair distance. By itself, a manageable enemy. But when put in a group and in a room lined with spike traps, you can imagine how much hilarity will ensue as you get knocked back and forth from one fish to another, either dying to those bites or, more funnily, getting knocked into a spike wall that kills you instantly. That's not even to mention the shark enemies that often accompany those fishy areas, who are more nimble than the Devil Piranha and equally deadly. Meaning, they absolutely suck. The worst enemy though, and probably my least favorite enemy in the game, is a series of rubber duck-looking creatures that you'll find late in the stage. When I first saw these ducks floating around, I thought, oh, that's funny. Rare's being silly by having a rubber duck float in the water after getting past the numerous underwater passages that preceded the duck. I literally thought to myself, oh cool, a reprieve. And then, as I approached the duck, it attacked me with such rapidity and force that I ceased to be a living being, as I was vaporized into a cloud of debris that just moments earlier represented an amphibious creature. After experiencing this Duck of Doom, I realized that someone at Rare was not okay when this game was being made. Seriously, I feel like there was some deep-seated disdain for gamers at the studio, where some nameless individual sat around late at night scheming about how to make the game even more hateful towards any prospective players. The Duck of Doom was simply the icing on top of an otherwise deadly menagerie of bad guys, and by this point, I was beginning to lose my grip on my sanity. And that's not to mention the other obstacles in the level, like the blind jumps that may or may not be into a pit of spikes, or the gears that chase you around various sections of the stage that insta-kill you if you touch them. The moment when I figured out the optimal path through Terror Tubes, I felt like Einstein when he came up with the theory of relativity. While I know many would argue that my discovery wasn't quite as impactful as his, I still felt really good when I solved that particular puzzle. And then, all of those good feelings evaporated because Stage 10 is Rat Race, which conceptually is super simple. You have to race a rat down a series of platforms to reach a bomb before he does, otherwise he blows you up. Okay, cool, sounds like fun, sort of. And the first two races are in fact pretty fun, as they provide some tension, but are 100% winnable with a bit of patience and level memorization. But then, you reach the third race, which is like if you took Usain Bolt and asked him to race against Eric Cartman, with me playing the role of Cartman. To say that the final race will feel impossible for quite some time is an understatement, as there is little you can do to beat the rat physically. Instead, you have to get smarter, using a combination of headbutts to slow the rat's progress, which in this context makes him repeat whatever platform he's currently on. This will buy you some time, but honestly, if you end up having to use this move late in the level, and you miss it on one of the platforms, you've effectively already lost. Luckily, there are some sections where a carefully choreographed fall can avoid multiple platforms, sending you into a quick free fall that, if Lady Luck is on your side, will let you get ahead of the rat, hopefully for good. All that's left is to progress through an electric gate that turns on and off, hopefully while it's off, to reach the bomb and win the third race, which will drop you into this stage's boss fight against a rhino kind of guy that looks remarkably like Rocksteady from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It turns out this is one of the easier boss fights in the game, as all you have to do is make sure you stay behind him whenever you try to attack. He does get progressively quicker the further into the fight you go, and the same rules around juggling and instant kill squash moves apply here, but this one should be doable with a bit of practice. After you beat up Rocksteady's less friendly cousin, you'll reach stage 11, which is called Klinger Winger, but is more aptly described as Beelzebub's unicycle racecourse. In this stage, you grab onto a powered unicycle, then your goal is to outrun an electric orb that's chasing you, who if it touches your body, will instantly kill you. As you move around the stage, you'll notice arrows on the track, which is the game's way of telling you which direction on your D-pad you need to hold down in order to move with any degree of speed. The trick here is that you cannot let go of the D-pad, and your timing around corners needs to be perfect, otherwise you will fail. And when I say perfect, I'm not using that term figuratively. I mean that actually cornering successfully, which gives you a small burst of speed and keeps you in front of your electric orb pursuer, requires a frame-perfect directional change, which, as you might imagine, is pretty darn difficult to pull off. I tried multiple controllers on multiple emulators to try to get the timing of D-pad switches right, only to fail at some point in the level, and the amount of practice I had to complete to become even moderately proficient at the stage was enough to cause a thumb injury and cause my hands to spasm for an hour after one of my runs. Note, I am not making this up. I legitimately injured myself on this level. Now, it turns out there is a bit of a trick, where if you can pause the game at that frame-perfect moment, which corresponds to 1/60th of a second for those who may be wondering, you'll notice your Battletoad floating next to his unicycle, which means that's the moment you need to press the next D-pad direction to get your speed boost. Interestingly, I got really good at pausing at that exact frame-perfect moment for the speed boost, which suggests to me that my timing was fine all along, but my D-pad, or perhaps my left thumb, couldn't turn that knowledge into action. After hours of practice, I eventually became good enough to beat this stage whenever I wanted, but without the pause trick, I would have probably ended up with a serious repetitive stress injury. If you do figure out the timing, you'll end up with the stage's boss, which is the aforementioned energy orb, who, like every other boss in the game, can crush you while also being able to electrocute you into oblivion. This fight can either be easy or hard depending on your luck and your ability to juggle enemies in the air. Ultimately, after some practice, this guy should be pretty doable, and after you beat him, you will reach the final platforming level in the game. And that final level, which is the 12th stage overall, is called the Revolution. And here again, the concept is pretty darn awesome. You have to ascend the final tower in the game, a huge cylindrical structure that you can literally walk around as you move side to side on a given platform, complete with pseudo 3D graphical perspectives and effects, which look amazing for an 8-bit title. Actually playing through the level is an exercise in frustration, as you not only have to deal with multiple insta-kill enemies, but you also have to deal with rotating spike traps, moving platforms, winds that will knock you off the tower to your death, and clouds that spew insta-kill acid rain. Something I haven't mentioned yet, but that becomes incredibly critical during this stage in particular, is the fact that as you progress through one of these vertical stages, you do not have the ability to descend that same stage. Meaning, once the platform that you were on disappears from view, it ceases to exist in the game world, instead becoming a bottomless pit that will instantly kill you if you happen to fall into it. Let me tell you how frustrating it is to miss a jump and then fall to your death, when there was a fully solid platform literally inches below the screen. Well, it's pretty darn frustrating. This was somewhat of an issue in prior stages like the elevator shaft climb and intruder excluder, but here it's even worse, since you're moving vertically with much shorter platform landing areas than any other stage. It's definitely tricky, and more than one of my runs ended right here, mere steps away from the final boss of the game. To say those were heartbreaking defeats would be an understatement. Assuming you manage to climb the tower, you'll then reach the final boss of the game, the Dark Queen herself, which is significant enough to get her own separate stage entitled Armageddon. For all the effort, determination, and fortitude it takes to make it this far, it's a bit surprising and definitely a relief that the final boss fight is actually pretty darn simple. You need to attack from behind and avoid her twirling tornado attack, which honestly isn't all that tricky. As long as you do that, victory is just a few hits away, and if you can make it this far, there is no doubt in my mind that you can beat the game. Oh, but before we move on, I want to mention one final surprise that the game has in store for you. If you do in fact defeat the Dark Queen, and you happen to stand in the center of the stage's singular platform after beating her, you'll be directly in her flight path as she tornadoes vertically to the top of a nearby cliff. If you do get caught in her flight path, she will unceremoniously kill you, forcing you to fight her again in order to successfully beat the game. Consider that Rare's parting gift to players who at this point are mere shells of their former selves, husks where light once shone, but now only darkness exists. That's how it feels when you finally beat the game. And yes, as with every game we've covered, I did beat it, and I did not use save states to accomplish that feat. I spent way more time learning the game than I ever expected to spend, so much so that I can literally draw out every stage and map on paper should someone ask me to do it. All told, I spent around 25 to 30 hours dying repeatedly at Battletoads before I emerged victorious, and on that final run, I only ended up using a single continue on the final stage of the game. I had finally conquered what many people consider to be one of the hardest games of all time. My only question is, was it worth it? Well, we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but first, as we always do, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially around this era of gaming where we didn't always have a lot of information to go off of. We may have had magazine articles or other reviews, but we didn't have the internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. When we made a buying decision, oftentimes it was in the store itself. Did the front of the box look cool? If so, we'd flip it over. Does the back of the box make the game sound even better? If so, we'd buy the game. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So for Battletoads for the NES, the back of the box says Battletoads. Okay, Toads, let's get even. When the evil Dark Queen kidnaps both your best buddy and the best looking girl this side of the Mazalian star cluster, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to cry? Hide? Call the Star Cops? No way, because you're a Battletoad, and Battletoads don't cry, hide, or call for help. Battletoads get real mad, and then they get even. So strap on your blaster, power up the Toadster, and get on down to the Dark Queen's planet. But watch out, Toad. This lady's bad, and she's got a whole mess of really nasty surprises lined up for you, like the Psycho Pigs, the Mutant Rat Pack, Robomanus, and the Saturn Toad Trap, to name but a few. You're going to need all your fighting skills to defeat her. The Battletoad Butt, the Big Bad Boot, and the Nuclear Knuckles. Hey, and don't forget to take along the Jet Turbo, the Space Board, and the Speed Bike, because you're going to need them all, Toad, if you're going to rescue your friends and get the frog out of there with your green skin intact. So let's get bad and crazy. Let's get mad, Toad, and then get even. For up to 2 players. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, of course, as there always are. And I've got to say, the box kind of does it for me. I'll be honest. It's kind of a little over the top. Definitely kind of almost like a drill sergeant-ish kind of thing going on there. It kind of appeals to me. I never did buy Battletoads back when it came out. I rented it a bunch from our local video game rental store, but I never owned Battletoads back in the day. The box, though, yeah, it's doing it for me. I will say this is not a bad box. Even knowing what comes in the box, which we're going to continue to talk about, even knowing that, the box itself is pretty darn great, I will admit. But that box is only one aspect of the overall package. Of course, the game itself is something we need to talk more about. So let's start by talking about the graphics. Battletoads is simply one of the best looking games on the NES. No doubt about it. The quality of the graphics on display here is light years beyond most 8-bit titles, with only the true industry behemoths like Super Mario Bros. 3 being challengers to Battletoads' detailed, well-designed visuals. Characters all look great and are distinct, while environments and screen backgrounds are all varied while still maintaining a consistent style throughout the game. And the brief in-game level cutscenes all feature high-quality full-screen character artwork. Animations similarly are smooth, and I especially enjoyed the comic book styled larger-than-life visuals that accompany the end-of-combo finishing moves that deal extra damage to your enemies. This includes a huge uppercut, a gigantic kick, and a ram's head headbutt, all of which look great and make the impact of those moves feel even more impressive than you might expect. Bottom line, Battletoads is one good-looking 8-bit game. Moving on to the sound and music, Battletoads soundtrack is one of the better musical compositions that you will hear on an NES, with diverse themes and expertly crafted arrangements that perfectly enhance the action occurring on the screen. This shouldn't come as a surprise, as Rare's in-house composing team usually does stellar work in getting the most out of whatever sound hardware they have access to, but it still warrants mentioning that this is a really good soundtrack. Sound effects, meanwhile, also sound pretty darn good, and the way these effects are used is particularly noteworthy, as there are several levels like Karnath's Lair where you need to use those sound effects to determine when the snake you're riding on has changed directions, because you won't necessarily have a visual to clue you into that shift in direction. In those instances, careful observation of the sound effects can benefit you greatly, and it's a testament to the game's sound design that this is something that works seamlessly with the rest of the experience. Overall, the sound here is top-notch, and I enjoyed every audible moment. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as the titular Battletoads, a group of 3 amphibians who explore the known cosmos for adventures to have and people to save. One day, one of your teammates, Pimple, takes a joyride with Angelica, a Terran princess who the Battletoads were escorting to meet her father, the Terran Emperor. That joyride ends in disaster, as both Pimple and Princess Angelica are kidnapped by the Dark Queen, an evil ruler who wants nothing more than to avenge prior defeats and take revenge on the people that are preventing her from ruling the universe. The 2 remaining Battletoads, Rash and Zitz, are the characters that players can control, and over the course of the game, you'll go on a world-spanning, spacefaring adventure to find and save your kidnapped friends, while at the same time, hopefully defeating the Dark Queen and sending her back into the dark corners of the cosmos, where she can no longer cause havoc and destruction for the peaceful inhabitants of the universe. The story here was pretty much what you'd expect from a platforming title from around this time, with probably a bit more backstory than what it absolutely needed in order to be a meaningful experience. As I've said countless times before, pure platforming titles do not need a deep story, because they're oftentimes designed to deliver quality gameplay, not necessarily strong narratives. Battletoads, having such a variety of stages and gameplay mechanics, is a bit different than a traditional platformer, and because of that, I think the story was definitely a worthwhile addition to the game, and it truly did work for me. Moving on to the playability and controls, while we were talking through the various stages in the game, we touched upon most of the controls and playability considerations in almost excessive depth, so I am not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to talk about explicitly, and something that was certainly implied by some of the words I used earlier, is the game's difficulty, which can border on obscene. Now, before I continue, I want to reiterate what some of you likely already know, which is that I truly do enjoy a good challenge, and I never shy away from a game simply because it's considered difficult. And as I play through these titles, I do so in the way the developers originally intended, meaning no save states, rewinds, or other modern creature comforts that serve to smooth out the difficulty in games that were designed from a decidedly old-school perspective. Even with that in mind, and even considering my own enjoyment of challenging games, I have to say that this one is just too much. It can absolutely be beaten with enough practice, memorization, and skill development. But the question is all of the frustration, silly design complications, and downright hateful attitude towards the player worth the time that you need to put into the game in order to gain the proficiency needed to be successful? Honestly, I don't know if it's worth it. Having spent so much time playing the game, I now feel like I have an appreciation for the overall experience, and I can actually sit down and play the title without significant stress, because I've developed the muscle memory needed to play the game the way its developers require it to be played. But that involved learning some lessons that were very specific to Battletoads, most of which were not great lessons to begin with, like conquering imprecise and floaty jump and platforming sections, executing beatdowns on enemies within a game engine that eschews some very standard beat-em-up conventions like hitting multiple enemies at the same time, dealing with numerous one-hit kill enemies with questionable mechanics, surviving blind jumps over and through beds of spikes, and making my way through a game whose designers seem to have one goal in mind: the absolute demolition of whatever soul you as a player had before playing the game. I think there are things the game does well, like the graphics, sound design, and overall gameplay diversity, but the obscene difficulty does a lot to entirely detract from the good side of the equation. There's a reason why the Japanese release had its difficulty tuned down when it was ported, and that's because the game was almost unfairly difficult much of the time. I know Rare didn't want people beating this one during a weekend rental, which is why they made the game so ludicrously challenging. But I truly feel they went too far, and the focus on breaking the player was simply too much in comparison to the more positive qualities of the title. I don't mean to be judgmental, but playing Battletoads was almost an entirely unenjoyable experience for well over 20 hours worth of gameplay, where I felt like I was continuously bashing my head against a wall, hoping the pain would stop. Eventually, though, I did start becoming proficient enough to consistently make meaningful progress, and in the process, I began to have some fun. By the time I beat the game, my feelings did change a bit, as levels that were once impossible now became trivial, and my focus shifted from simply surviving to trying to maximize my time on bosses and levels alike. There is goodness to be had here, but the effort required to get there is way more than I think anyone should have to put themselves through. So what is our overall verdict on Battletoads? Well, I gotta say, this is a tough one to categorize, because on one hand, the game can be fun, and once you're proficient at the mechanics and memorize the levels, you'll most likely have a good time playing it. I can also see the quality of various elements of the game's design, and can appreciate, in retrospect, some design decisions that while playing felt like a smack in the face. That being said, I do not think you should play this game unless you know what you're getting into, as the time and effort required to find any sort of enjoyment with the title is so great that I can't in good conscience recommend anyone to play it. But I also can't discount the things it does well, and I truly believe that if its difficulty was tuned down just a little bit, it'd be a certifiable classic. That is not the game we have though, which is why for me, Battletoads just barely grabs a spot on our list of golden oldies. But that verdict comes with a caveat. While I think the game in totality is actually more good than bad, I do not think many people will feel the same until they devote tons of hours to the experience. This is much too high of a barrier to entry, and I implore you, if you value your sanity, do not play this game. Feel content in knowing that it's a pretty good game eventually, a very challenging experience, and something that you should admire from afar, not close up. While I truly don't think anyone should put themselves through the torture of playing this game, ironically, it's still a title that deserves some praise and recognition for what it does well, which is why Battletoads ultimately deserves its spot on our list of golden oldies. That was our episode on Battletoads. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Command and Conquer, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you to make sure we are hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to deliver the content that makes sense for everybody listening, and I want to continue to make this the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Command and Conquer. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.